My son's text arrived while I was arranging fresh daisies in the guest bedroom he'd once called his sanctuary. "You're uninvited to our cruise. My wife doesn't want to babysit an old lady." I dropped my phone like it had caught fire, the screen cracking against the hardwood floor. But that broken phone would soon become the least of Bradley's problems. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. I'm Margaret Thompson, 64 years old, and until that Tuesday afternoon, I thought I knew exactly where I stood in my family. I'd raised Bradley as a single mother after his father died in a construction accident when Bradley was 12. For 30 years, it had been just us against the world, or so I believed. The cruise invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, a cheerful card with palm trees and turquoise water. "Mom, Ashley and I want you to join us for a Mediterranean cruise this summer. Our treat," Bradley had written in his careful handwriting. I'd been so touched that I immediately started shopping for cruise clothes, something I hadn't done since my honeymoon 42 years ago. I'd spent $800 on new outfits, gotten my first passport, and even splurged on a professional pedicure. The excitement had kept me awake for weeks, planning conversations with Ashley that might finally bridge the gap between us. She'd been polite but distant during their 5-year marriage, and I'd hoped this trip might change that. Standing in the guest room with wilted daisies scattered across the floor, I reread Bradley's message. The cruelty wasn't just in the words, but in the timing. The cruise was next week. My bags were already packed downstairs, my neighbor arranged to collect mail, my garden watered for a month-long absence. I walked to the window overlooking the backyard where Bradley had played as a child. The swing set I'd bought him still stood there, rusted but solid. He'd spent hours on that swing, telling me about his dreams of becoming an architect, building houses that would last forever. Now he was building a family that apparently had no room for the woman who'd sacrificed everything to give him those dreams. My hands weren't shaking when I picked up the cracked phone. I wasn't crying either. Something colder had settled in my chest, something that felt almost like relief, because Bradley had finally shown me exactly who he'd become, and I was about to show him exactly who I'd always been underneath the accommodating mother act. The house deed was in the kitchen drawer. The house I'd bought them as a wedding gift. The house they thought they owned free and clear. But legal ownership and moral ownership are two very different things, and Bradley was about to learn that lesson the hard way. That evening, I sat in my late husband David's study, surrounded by file folders I hadn't touched in 5 years. The house deed lay spread across the mahogany desk, every legal detail crystal clear under the banker's lamp. My name alone appeared as owner, just as I'd planned when I'd given Bradley and Ashley what they believed was their dream home. The phone rang twice before Bradley answered. "Mom, I got your message. Look, I know you're upset about the cruise, but Ashley really feels—" "Bradley," I interrupted, my voice calmer than I felt. "We need to talk about the house on Elmwood Street." Silence stretched between us like a taut wire. When he finally spoke, his tone had shifted from defensive to confused. "What about it? Mom, that's our house. You gave it to us for our wedding." "I let you live in it," I corrected gently. "There's a difference." More silence. Then Ashley's voice in the background, sharp and demanding. "What's she talking about? Tell her we're busy packing." I'd spent the afternoon with my attorney, Margaret Caldwell, reviewing the papers I'd signed 5 years ago. The house transfer had been structured as a gift with specific conditions that Bradley had apparently forgotten in his eagerness to claim ownership. The most important condition was respect and care for the gift giver, a condition he'd just spectacularly violated. "Bradley, I'm going to text you some documents to review. We'll discuss them when you return from your cruise." "Mom, what documents? You're scaring me." I almost smiled at that. "Have a wonderful time in the Mediterranean, dear. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine." After hanging up, I called Margaret Caldwell's office and left a message for her assistant. "Please begin processing the Elmwood Street property transfer. Full documentation by Friday." Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened David's old travel books, the ones we'd collected but never had time to use. France, Italy, Ireland, places we'd promised ourselves we'd visit when we retired. Before that accident stole that dream away, the irony wasn't lost on me. Bradley was taking his wife on a cruise while uninviting his mother, not knowing that his mother was about to take herself on a much more permanent vacation. And unlike his cruise, Mine wouldn't have a return date. I poured myself a glass of David's vintage bourbon, the bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion. Apparently, legal revenge qualified as special. Outside, evening shadows crept across the lawn, and somewhere in California, Bradley was probably trying to explain to Ashley why his mother had suddenly become interested in property law. By morning, I would own one less house and gain one unlimited future. The question wasn't whether I could do this, it was whether I was finally brave enough to become the woman David had always believed I could be. Friday morning arrived with the paperwork from Margaret Caldwell's office. Every document perfectly executed. Every signature notarized. Every legal requirement satisfied. The house on Elmwood Street was now officially for sale, with proceeds to be held in trust pending Bradley's return from his Mediterranean adventure. I stood on the front porch of my own home, sipping coffee and watching the "for sale" sign being installed across town through binoculars. The real estate agent, Patricia Wells, had assured me she could move the property quickly. 3-bedroom colonial in that neighborhood? We'll have offers by Monday. My phone had been buzzing constantly since yesterday. Bradley calling from the airport, then from their hotel in Barcelona. Ashley's number appearing repeatedly. Though she'd never called me directly in 5 years of marriage, I'd let every call go to voicemail. The messages grew increasingly frantic. "Mom, Patricia Wells called saying our house is for sale. This has to be a mistake." Then, "Mom, please call me back. Ashley is freaking out." And finally, "This morning, we're flying home. Cancel whatever you think you're doing." But I wasn't canceling anything. I was accelerating. Margaret Caldwell arrived at 11 with final documentation and a bottle of champagne. "You know, Margaret," she said, settling into David's old chair, "in 30 years of practicing law, I've never helped anyone execute quite such an elegant revenge." "It's not revenge," I corrected, though I was smiling. "It's consequences." Bradley made a choice when he sent that text. He chose to treat his mother like a burden rather than a blessing. I'm simply responding to his choice with one of my own. We reviewed the trust documents. Everything Bradley and Ashley had paid toward the house over 5 years, mortgage payments, improvements, taxes, was being calculated and would be returned to them. I wasn't stealing from them. I was reclaiming what had always been mine while ensuring they weren't financially devastated. "Where will you go?" Margaret asked. I showed her the travel brochures I'd collected. "I'm thinking Ireland first. David always said his grandmother's cottage in County Cork was the most beautiful place on earth. Then maybe France, Italy, wherever the wind takes me. And if Bradley wants to reconcile when he returns?" I considered this carefully. "He'll have to prove he's learned something about respect and humility and the difference between having a mother and deserving one." After Margaret left, I began packing. Not everything, just enough for a long journey with an uncertain destination. Clothes that made me feel confident, books I'd been meaning to read, photographs of David and happier times with Bradley. The house felt different already, lighter somehow. For 5 years, I'd been living as if I were shrinking, making myself smaller to accommodate Bradley and Ashley's vision of what a mother-in-law should be. Quiet, convenient, grateful for whatever scraps of attention they offered. But I'd forgotten something important. I'd forgotten that I was Margaret Thompson, the woman who'd raised a son alone, who'd built a successful career teaching high school literature, who'd loved and been loved by a remarkable man. Somewhere along the way, I'd let myself become just Bradley's mom, instead of remembering I was also David's wife, Margaret's friend, and most importantly, my own person. Saturday brought rain and the first serious offer on the Elmwood Street house. Patricia Wells called at 9 with news that would change everything. "Margaret, we have 3 offers, all above asking price. One buyer wants to close in 10 days. Cash sale." I sat in my kitchen, watching raindrops race down the window, and felt something close to euphoria. "Accept the highest offer, Patricia. And yes, 10 days is perfect." Bradley and Ashley's flight would land tomorrow evening. They'd return to find strangers measuring windows for new curtains and a "sold" sticker across the for sale sign. The timing was so perfect, it felt like the universe was finally paying attention to my prayers. My phone rang again. Bradley's number. This time, I answered. "Mom, thank God. We've been trying to reach you for 3 days. What is happening? Why is our house for sale?" His voice carried that particular blend of panic and indignation that I remembered from his teenage years when consequences caught up with his choices. But he wasn't 16 anymore, and this wasn't about missing curfew. Bradley, I told you we'd discuss this when you returned. How's the cruise? How's the cruise? Mom, our house is being sold. Ashley hasn't stopped crying since we found out. She's making herself sick over this. I'm sorry Ashley is upset, I said, and meant it. But you both made your feelings about me very clear. I'm simply responding accordingly. What feelings? Mom, you're being dramatic. Ashley just thought the cruise would be more romantic with just the two of us. It wasn't personal. I closed my eyes, remembering the exact words of his text. Bradley, you called me an old lady who needed babysitting. You uninvited me from a family vacation with less ceremony than you'd cancel a dentist appointment. How exactly was that not personal? Silence. Then Ashley's voice in the background, shrill and demanding. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. Blame, anger, desperation. Mom, just don't sell the house. Please. We'll pay you rent if that's what you want. We'll figure something out. The house sold this morning, Bradley. Closing is Tuesday. The silence that followed was so complete, I wondered if the call had dropped. When Bradley spoke again, his voice was smaller, younger. Where are we supposed to live? I don't know, son, but I suspect you'll figure it out. You're both very resourceful adults. After hanging up, I made myself lunch and continued packing. Tomorrow evening, Bradley and Ashley would land at Cleveland Hopkins Airport and drive home to a house that was no longer theirs. They'd use their key in a lock that had already been changed, ring a doorbell that would be answered by the new owners. I'd be 3 states away by then, staying in a small bed and breakfast in Vermont while my paperwork processed for an extended European visa. David and I had talked about Vermont in autumn. The maple leaves and covered bridges. I'd go there first, let the colors heal something in my soul before crossing the ocean. By the time Bradley figured out how to reach me, I'd be ready to listen, but not to apologize. Those days were over. The bed and breakfast in Vermont exceeded every expectation. Maple Grove Inn sat on 40 acres of woodland, with guest rooms that felt like pages from a fairy tale. I'd booked the Rose Room, with its antique 4-poster bed and windows overlooking a small pond where geese gathered each morning. It had been 3 days since Bradley and Ashley returned to find strangers living in their former home. 3 days since I'd driven north into a new life, leaving behind 34 years of single motherhood and 5 years of being treated like an inconvenient relative. Sarah, the inn's owner, was a woman about my age who'd left corporate law to chase a dream of hospitality. We'd bonded over coffee and her homemade scones, sharing stories of late-life reinvention and the courage it takes to start over. Any regrets? She asked that morning as we watched the geese through her kitchen window. About the house? None. About taking so long to stand up for myself? Every day. My phone had been silent since Tuesday. Either Bradley was too shocked to call, or Ashley had convinced him that his mother had lost her mind. Both possibilities seemed equally likely. But I wasn't the same woman who'd received that cruel text message 8 days ago. That woman had been living small, grateful for crumbs of affection from a son who'd forgotten she deserved more. This woman was sitting in a charming inn in Vermont, planning a European adventure that would have made David proud. Margaret Caldwell had called yesterday with final numbers. After returning Bradley and Ashley's payments and covering legal fees, I'd cleared enough from the house sale to fund 2 years of comfortable travel. Combined with my teacher's pension and David's life insurance, I could afford to discover who Margaret Thompson might become when she stopped defining herself through other people's needs. There's something I want to show you, Sarah said, leading me to her office. She pulled out a photo album filled with pictures of guests who'd stayed at Maple Grove Inn over the past 5 years. Every single person in these photos was running from something, or toward something, usually both. I flipped through pages of smiling faces, reading the notes guests had left, stories of divorce, retirement, loss, new beginnings. Women my age starting art careers, men learning to cook, couples rediscovering each other after children left home. Where do you think you're running? Sarah asked gently. I thought about Bradley as a boy, climbing into my bed during thunderstorms. I thought about Ashley, polite but distant at every family gathering. I thought about David, who died believing our son would take care of me in my golden years. I'm not running from anything. I realized as I spoke. I'm running toward the woman I was before I became afraid of taking up too much space in my own life. That afternoon, I drove to the local library and used their computer to book my flight to Ireland. Shannon Airport, County Clare, departure in 2 weeks. Enough time to get my affairs in order, say goodbye to friends who'd wondered why I'd seemed so diminished lately. The librarian, a kind woman with silver braids, helped me print my boarding pass. First time to Ireland? First time anywhere, really. My husband and I planned to travel after retirement, but cancer had other plans. She smiled knowingly. My Harold was the same way, always putting off adventures until someday. I learned after he passed that someday never comes unless you make it today. As I drove back to Maple Grove Inn, my phone finally rang. Bradley's number. This time I felt ready to answer. "Mom, we need to talk." Bradley's voice carried none of its usual confidence. 3 days of sleeping in a hotel while searching for a rental had apparently humbled him considerably. "I'm listening," I said, settling into the comfortable chair by my window. The geese were returning to their pond, and evening light painted everything gold. Ashley and I found a small apartment, month-to-month lease until we figure out what's next. He paused, and I could hear traffic in the background. "Mom, I know you're angry, but selling our house was extreme. We could have worked this out." "Your house?" I kept my voice gentle but firm. "Bradley, I need you to understand something. That was never your house. It was my gift to you, contingent on treating the gift giver with respect and love. I do respect you, Mom. I love you. Then why did you call me an old lady who needed babysitting? Why did you uninvite me from a family vacation via text message like I was some casual acquaintance?" Silence stretched between us. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller. Ashley said, "She thought you might feel like a third wheel, that maybe you'd be more comfortable staying home. And you believed that instead of asking me directly?" More silence. In the background, Ashley's voice rose in what sounded like an argument, though I couldn't make out words. Their stress was audible, their careful life disrupted by consequences they'd never anticipated. "Mom, where are you? We went to your house, but Mrs. Patterson said you'd gone traveling. You never travel." "I'm in Vermont, planning a trip to Ireland. Your father always wanted to visit his grandmother's homeland." "Ireland? Mom, you can't just disappear to Ireland. What if something happens? What if you need help?" For the first time in our conversation, I smiled. "Bradley, I'm 64 years old, not 94. I taught high school for 32 years. I managed our family finances, raised you alone, and built a life that worked. Why would you assume I can't handle travel? Because you never—" He stopped, apparently realizing how his words sounded. "Because I never put myself first? Because I spent 30 years making sure you had everything you needed, even when it meant I had nothing left for myself?" The silence that followed felt different, heavier. Finally, Bradley spoke, his voice thick with something that might have been realization. "Mom, I'm sorry. About the text, about the cruise, about taking the house for granted. Ashley and I got comfortable thinking you'd always just be there. I'll always be your mother, Bradley. But being taken for granted? That chapter of my life is closed." After we hung up, I sat watching the geese settle in for the night. Tomorrow I'd start the drive back to Ohio to finalize my travel plans and say proper goodbyes. In 2 weeks, I'd be boarding a plane for the first solo adventure of my life. Bradley had sounded genuinely contrite, and perhaps this experience would teach him something valuable about respect and gratitude. But whether it did or didn't, I was done shaping my life around his growth process. Margaret Thompson was going to Ireland, and maybe France, and possibly Italy. She was going to discover what it felt like to wake up each morning with no one's needs to consider but her own. And if her son wanted to rebuild their relationship, he'd have to prove he understood the difference between having a mother and deserving one. 3 months in Ireland changed everything, but it was the letter waiting at my hotel in Dublin that changed everything again. Hotel staff had forwarded it from 3 previous locations, and the return address made my hands shake. Caldwell and Associates Legal Services, urgent. Margaret Caldwell's message was brief, but earth-shattering. Bradley had filed a lawsuit claiming elder abuse and demanding I return the house sale proceeds. He was alleging I was mentally incompetent when I sold the property. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was that Ashley had filed for divorce, claiming Bradley had manipulated me to fund their lifestyle while hiding his gambling debts. I sat in my small Dublin hotel room, rain pattering against the windows, and laughed until tears came. Bradley, my responsible architect's son, had apparently been living a double life. Ashley's divorce papers, attached to Margaret's letter, painted a picture of secret casino visits, online betting accounts, and credit cards maxed out behind her back. The house sale money hadn't been about revenge after all. It had been about survival. Bradley needed those funds to pay off gambling debts that could have destroyed both their lives. His cruel text about uninviting me hadn't been casual cruelty. It had been desperate manipulation by a man drowning in his own poor choices. My phone rang. Margaret Caldwell's number. Margaret, I assume you've read my letter? Every word. Is it true? The gambling? Ashley provided bank statements, credit reports, everything. Bradley owes approximately $80,000 to various creditors. Some of them aren't the patient type, if you understand my meaning. I understood perfectly. What does Bradley want from me? He wants you to return home immediately and give him power of attorney to access the house sale funds. He's claiming the gambling was stress-related due to worrying about your mental state after David's death. The audacity was breathtaking. And Ashley? Ashley is furious. She genuinely didn't know about the gambling until after you sold the house, and Bradley panicked. She's asking for spousal support and half their remaining assets, which amounts to roughly $4,000 and a car with payments due. That evening, I walked along the River Liffey, watching Dublin come alive in the twilight. Street musicians played traditional Irish songs while couples strolled hand in hand. I'd spent 3 months discovering parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. I'd taken cooking classes in Cork, learned to knit in Galway, and even went on 2 dates with a charming retired professor named Patrick who'd shown me the real Dublin beyond tourist attractions. Now Bradley needed me to save him from consequences he'd created while treating me like a burden. The irony was so perfect, it felt scripted. I flew back to Ohio 2 days later, but not to rescue Bradley. I returned to face him as the woman I'd become, not the accommodating mother I'd been. Margaret Caldwell met me at the airport, her expression mixing professional concern with personal curiosity. "You look different," she observed as we drove toward her office. "Ireland agreed with you." I touched my shorter, more stylish haircut and smiled. Everything agreed with me. That's rather the point. Bradley was waiting in Margaret's conference room, looking like he'd aged 5 years in 3 months. Dark circles under his eyes, clothes that hung loose on his frame, hands that trembled slightly when he reached for his coffee cup. This wasn't the confident man who'd sent that cruel text. This was someone who'd hit bottom and was still falling. "Mom, thank God you came back." He stood to hug me, but I remained seated. "Sit down, Bradley. We need to discuss your situation." Margaret spread documents across the table. Bank statements, credit reports, loan agreements, and divorce papers. The evidence of Bradley's secret life, laid out in black and white. $87,000, I said, reading from the credit summary. "How long have you been gambling?" His face flushed red. It started small. Just poker nights with guys from work, then some online stuff. It got out of hand after Dad died. David died 5 years ago, Bradley. I know, but losing him, watching you struggle with grief, it was stressful. I needed an outlet. I set down the papers and studied my son. "So your solution to my grief was to develop a gambling addiction, lie to your wife, and treat your mother like a burden? I never meant for it to go this far. And the text about the cruise? I was just stressed about money. Ashley kept talking about how expensive it would be to pay for 3 people instead of 2. Margaret cleared her throat. "Bradley, your mother isn't here to be lectured about your financial planning. She's here because you're claiming she was mentally incompetent when she sold the house." Bradley's face went pale. I had to say something. "These people I owe money to, they're not patient. They're talking about broken legs and worse." "Whose fault is that?" I asked calmly. "I know it's my fault. But Mom, you have the money. You could help me fix this." I leaned back in my chair, thinking about Patrick in Dublin, who'd told me stories of his children learning to solve their own problems. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Give me the house money. It's enough to pay off the debts and start over." Ashley might even reconsider the divorce if I can prove I'm getting help. And what do I get in return? Bradley looked confused by the question. You get your son back, your family. I almost laughed. Bradley, I've spent 3 months in Ireland discovering that I already have everything I need. I don't need to buy back your respect or Ashley's tolerance. The next morning brought a call that changed the entire dynamic. Margaret Caldwell phoned at 7 a.m. with news that made everything clear. Margaret, I've been investigating Bradley's creditors. 3 of his debts are to legitimate credit card companies, but the big ones, the ones he's worried about, are to illegal gambling operations. If we pay them, we could be charged with money laundering. I sat up in my hotel bed, suddenly wide awake. What are you saying? I'm saying Bradley isn't just in financial trouble. He's in legal trouble. The FBI has been investigating the online gambling ring he was involved with. Several participants have already been arrested. An hour later, I was back in Margaret's office, this time with FBI agent Sarah Chen, a sharp-eyed woman who'd been tracking Bradley's activities for months. Mrs. Thompson, your son has been gambling with an illegal operation that launders money for organized crime. His debts aren't just to casino operators. They're to people who use gambling debts to trap individuals into other illegal activities. What kind of activities? Money laundering? Mostly. Bradley hasn't crossed that line yet, but he's being pressured. His sudden need for $87,000 isn't just about paying debts. It's about avoiding being forced into criminal activity. I thought about Bradley's desperation, his claims about broken legs, and worse. What happens if I give him the money? 2 problems. First, it likely violates federal money laundering statutes. Second, it doesn't solve his real problem. These people don't just want money, they want ongoing compliance. Paying them off would just make Bradley a more valuable asset. Agent Chen showed me photographs of other gambling victims who'd gotten trapped in the same web. Respectable professionals who'd started with small bets and ended up as unwilling participants in criminal enterprises. What are my options? Cooperate with our investigation. Let us wire Bradley with recording equipment when he meets his handlers. Help us build a case against the operation while keeping your son out of prison. I left the FBI office with my head spinning. 3 months ago, my biggest worry was planning a European vacation. Now I was being asked to help catch criminals who'd trapped my son in a web of debt and illegal activity. But something had changed in me during those months in Ireland. I'd discovered I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, more resourceful, more independent. I'd also learned the difference between helping someone and enabling them. Bradley needed help, but not the kind he was asking for. He needed to be freed from the criminal web he'd gotten caught in, even if it meant facing consequences he'd rather avoid. That evening I called him. Bradley, we need to meet tomorrow, but not to discuss money. The coffee shop where Bradley and I met felt like neutral territory, busy enough for privacy, but public enough for safety. He looked terrible, unshaven, jumpy, constantly checking his phone. Mom, did you think about what I asked? These people, they're getting impatient. I know exactly who these people are, Bradley. I spent yesterday with the FBI learning about the illegal gambling operation that has you trapped. His face went white. Coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. FBI? Mom, what did you do? I found out the truth. You're not just in debt. You're being groomed for criminal activity. These people don't want their money back. They want you as a permanent asset. Bradley's hands started shaking. You don't understand. If I don't pay them by Friday, they'll hurt Ashley. They know where she works, where her sister lives. They've made it very clear. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt genuine fear, not for myself, but for the innocent people being threatened because of my son's choices. Bradley, there's a way out, but it requires courage. The FBI wants you to cooperate with their investigation. Help them build a case against these people. You want me to wear a wire? Mom, these aren't white-collar criminals. These are dangerous people who hurt anyone who crosses them. I reached across the table and took his shaking hands. Son, you're already in danger. Ashley's already in danger. The only way out is through. We sat in silence while Bradley processed this information. Around us, normal people lived normal lives, unaware that a few poor choices could lead to criminal entanglement and federal investigations. What happens if I cooperate? He finally asked. Agent Chen says you'll likely face charges for illegal gambling, but cooperation could mean probation instead of prison. More importantly, you'll be free from these people forever. And if I don't cooperate, you become a criminal yourself, or you disappear, or worse. Bradley stared into his coffee cup like it held answers to questions he'd never wanted to ask. How did I get here, Mom? How did I become the kind of person who threatens his own mother for money? That was the question I'd been waiting for him to ask. You got here by making choices, and then making more choices to cover up the consequences of the first choices. But it's not too late to make different choices. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Chen. Meeting arranged for tomorrow 2 p.m. Is your son ready? I showed Bradley the message. This is your chance to be the man your father raised you to be. The man I know you still are underneath all these mistakes. For the first time in months, Bradley looked me directly in the eyes. Will you come with me to the FBI meeting? Yes, I said without hesitation. But not to pay your debts or clean up your mess. I'll come as your mother, supporting you while you fix this yourself. He nodded, tears finally coming. I'm sorry, Mom, for everything. The text, the house, treating you like you owed me something instead of remembering everything you gave me. I know you are, son. Now let's figure out how to get you out of this mess with your integrity intact. The FBI sting operation happened 3 days later in the parking lot of a shopping center Bradley had been instructed to visit. I watched from Agent Chen's surveillance van as my son, wearing a wire and carrying a briefcase full of marked bills, walked toward a black sedan where 2 men waited. My heart pounded as Bradley approached the car. Through the van's sophisticated listening equipment, we heard every word of the conversation. The men weren't just collecting money. They were detailing Bradley's next assignment. He was supposed to deposit specific amounts in different bank accounts, essentially laundering money through legitimate transactions. Your mother's house money will cover your current debt, one voice said, but you'll be making regular deposits from now on. Think of it as your new job. Bradley's voice came through clearly as he followed the script Agent Chen had provided. What if I want out after this payment? Harsh laughter filled the van. Nobody gets out, architect. You're too valuable now. Clean credit, respectable job, desperate enough to do what you're told. Agent Chen nodded to her team. Within seconds, FBI agents surrounded the black sedan. I watched through binoculars as handcuffs were applied and rights were read. Bradley stood safely to the side, no longer a victim, but not yet free from consequences. 2 hours later, we sat in the FBI office as Agent Chen explained what would happen next. The gambling ring Bradley had been involved with was part of a larger operation that had defrauded victims across 3 states. His cooperation had provided the final evidence needed to dismantle the entire network. Bradley will face charges for illegal gambling, but given his cooperation and the coercive circumstances, we're recommending probation and mandatory addiction counseling, Agent Chen explained. Bradley looked exhausted, but relieved. What about Ashley? Is she safe now? These particular individuals will be in federal custody for a very long time. The threats against your wife are no longer a concern. As we left the federal building, Bradley and I walked in comfortable silence toward my rental car. The man beside me looked like my son again, not the desperate stranger who'd been sending cruel text messages and demanding money. Mom, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but is there any chance we can rebuild our relationship? I stopped walking and faced him. Bradley, I've learned something important these past few months. I can't rebuild our relationship for both of us. You'll have to prove through actions that you understand the difference between having a mother and deserving one. What does that mean? It means respecting me as a person, not just as someone who's supposed to meet your needs. It means understanding that my life has value beyond what I can provide for you. Bradley nodded slowly. I'd like to try, if you'll let me. I'm going back to Ireland next month, I said. I've rented a cottage in County Cork for 6 months. You're welcome to write letters, real letters where you tell me about the work you're doing on yourself. Just letters? For now. I need to continue discovering who Margaret Thompson is when she's not defined by being Bradley's mother. And you need to discover who Bradley Thompson is when he's not dependent on his mother's resources. We hugged goodbye in the parking lot, but it felt different from our previous embraces. This felt like a beginning rather than an ending. 6 months later, I would receive Bradley's first letter describing his progress in addiction counseling and his efforts to rebuild his life with Ashley, who had withdrawn her divorce papers after learning the full truth. But that afternoon, driving away from the federal building, I was thinking about Patrick in Dublin and the cottage overlooking the Irish Sea where I planned to spend my winter writing the story of a woman who'd learned to value herself. Bradley had called me a burden, then discovered he was the one who needed carrying. I'd thought I was selling a house in revenge, but I'd actually been saving both our lives. Sometimes the best gift you can give someone is refusing to rescue them from consequences they need to face. My phone buzzed with a message from Patrick. "Cottage is ready when you are. Still have that bottle of wine we never opened." I texted back, "On my way." And Patrick, "I'm finally ready for that conversation about second chances." The woman who'd received that cruel cruise text 6 months ago might have spent the rest of her life wondering what she'd done wrong. The woman driving toward the airport was wondering what adventure would come next. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.